Ah, the age-old question. What is canon in Dragon Ball? Or on a more specific note, is Dragon Ball Super canon? Or Daima? Or anything? This feels like a never-ending debate, and it always depends on what's being discussed. Whether someone wants to fit a power scaling agenda, or someone's trying to prove a point, or someone's just trying to explain this to a friend, it always feels like there's no definitive answer. To the point where people basically make up their own rules. Dude, everything after the original manga doesn't matter.
Dragon Ball Super's anime is canon, but not the manga.
Daima is more canon than Dragon Ball Super because I said so. You know, stuff like that. I made a video recently about Dragon Ball Z's anime continuity and how weird that is, so I recommend checking that out if you haven't. But that just covers the Z anime, and all of Toei's stuff with the movies and GT. This goes beyond with modern Dragon Ball. My view on it? Debating quote-unquote canon is pointless, when it comes to Dragon Ball at least. Let me explain why. So things start off pretty simple. We've already covered the Dragon Ball Z anime, GT, and the Z movies in the previous video, so we know to separate that. A lot of people consider things canon if it was just made by Toriyama specifically. So, okay, first, we have Dragon Ball. And that's it. That's just a Dragon Ball manga. Everything from the Pilaf arc to the Peaceful World saga. Sounds pretty simple, right? Well, if you ignore literally everything that happened after the manga, then yeah. Because Toriyama's involvement didn't end here. Sure, this is the product that he had the most involvement in because he drew everything here and he made the story, but he's had involvement beyond that. For example, look at the Peaceful World arc at the end of Dragon Ball Z. Toriyama wrote it and it's in the original manga, so surely it's canon, right? Well yeah, but it contradicts Super. Okay, so then Super's not canon. No, that is written by Toriyama. To an extent. We'll get into that. And there's like 3 separate versions of that story. Not to mention, Daima exists, which technically does fit into the manga without contradicting too much, but it messes things up in its own way, and that does have Toriyama's involvement too. This is why things get really complicated once we move past the Buu saga. So if your view is that anything with Toriyama's involvement is canon, that opens a big can of worms. What level of involvement from Toriyama is needed for something to be considered canon? Because there's a few instances where his own writing contradicts itself. So unless you're going under the assumption that everything beyond the original manga doesn't matter, then yeah, we kinda need to discuss this. Because he had hands in a lot of projects. He even did help with some aspects of GT in the movies after all. Not when it comes to writing, but he still was involved, so does that mean it has his blessing? Or is that too little involvement? Where do we draw the line? And if there is a line to be drawn, then why do so many things contradict each other? And also that poses the question, does that just mean everything past the original manga isn't canon? We're going to try and answer all that and more. First, outlining everything and showing how many different canons there are in general, and seeing if there is a definitive answer as to what truly is canon, like a piece of Dragon Ball that holds more precedence than anything else in modern Dragon Ball. We'll go chronologically, and for this we go all the way back to 2008. There's a pretty overlooked project following the original manga, and that was an OVA. This one actually did get its own manga, but it wasn't drawn by Toriyama, although he did create the concept for it. It's titled The Return of Son Goku and Friends, the one where Tarbell's involved, Vegeta's brother. This takes place 2 years after the Buu saga, which is pretty close to when Daima occurs actually, which we'll cover later. This story is the first sequel post-GT, and it doesn't really mess up any timelines or anything. Toriyama was involved with making the concept, but the extent to which he contributed to everything is a little vague. And as we go through this video, you'll see this is kind of a common theme. Toriyama has involvement in a lot of projects, but no one really knows the true extent to which he is involved, with a few exceptions. For example, the concept of the OVA was made by him, but he didn't write the screenplay. As for the manga, he's credited as author and supervisor, but that doesn't necessarily mean he wrote everything here, especially because Koyama is also credited on this. And he wrote the screenplay for the OVA, and he works on basically all the other Dragon Ball movies. After this, there are 4 movies in the modern Dragon Ball world. 2 are Dragon Ball Z, and 2 are Dragon Ball Super. Battle of Gods, Resurrection F, Broly, and Superhero. Battle of Gods actually started production before Toriyama got involved. There's a rumor that he made this in response to Dragon Ball Evolution, but no, this was already a thing. He still wasn't fond of that movie though, so this film wasn't his direct response to that, although the film apparently looked very different before Toriyama got fully involved. He basically reworked everything, to the point where you could say he definitely had some heavy involvement. Despite being under the Dragon Ball Z title, these were later adapted into Super. Battle of Gods does reference Tarbell, and so does Broly, so it's pretty easy to establish that this is part of that continuity too. If it was a one-off thing in Battle of Gods, sure you can kinda write that off, but the fact that it's mentioned later on in Broly as well, that points to Toriyama viewing all of this as connected, because according to Battle of Gods, the events with Tarbell happened beforehand. That side note aside, whether it be concepts, designs, or even the actual scripts in some cases, these films have heavy involvement from him. That's not to say he wrote these completely solo, because like I mentioned, Battle of Gods started production even before he was involved. But as for the other 3 films, he seems mostly credited for the script and everything, and in the case of Broly, he even wrote a longer script originally, which had to get cut down. But after Battle of Gods, things aren't really straightforward. In between these 4 films, right in the middle, there's a pretty big thing that we need to cover that causes a lot of confusion. Dragon Ball Super, both the anime and the manga. What's so weird about this? It should just fit into the timeline easily, right? Well, you would think so, but there are a few different versions of Dragon Ball Super. I'm sure you all know that the anime and the manga versions are separate. If you've ever read the manga, you could easily see that a lot of it happens differently. So what's the third version I'm talking about? Well, this is the one that I'll just call Toriyama's outline. In the anime, Toei comes up with a lot of the extra stuff for Dragon Ball Super, while in the manga, Toyotaro comes up with that stuff, to an extent. Let's start with the anime first, because that's a little bit easier to cover, particularly with the outline itself. Toriyama did not write the full script for Super. He had heavy involvements in the movies, particularly in Superhero, of which he wrote even the dialogue for, but those 4 films pretty closely follow his vision. As for everything in between, he had specific plot points in mind. Now, the unfortunate thing is, we don't know exactly what plot points he had in mind. The full Toriyama outline of things was never truly seen. Anyways, the anime started in 2015, and the first piece of Toriyama's outline was that it should adapt the 2 movies, Battle of Gods and Resurrection F. Then, the first original arc happened, the Universe X Tournament. This anime continued all the way up until the Tournament of Power, and it's basically left at that. The manga actually released around the same time, but there are some weird differences. For one, it doesn't fully cover Resurrection F. Toyotaro did actually make his own adaptation of it, but weirdly enough that came a few months before Dragon Ball Super started. So this came out before the Battle of Gods portion of the manga, and it's also incomplete. It ends before Goku and Frieza even transform. And this is never finished. Resurrection F just isn't included in the manga beyond this. It's referenced, but nothing beyond it. Also, the manga did release monthly, so at some point it actually fell behind the anime. Even though the anime had some filler episodes and even a filler arc with Copy Vegeta, the final episode of Dragon Ball Super dropped in March 2018, while the manga's final chapter of the Tournament of Power didn't drop until November of that year, which is even stranger because that arc was even shorter in the manga than it was in the anime. But there are plenty of differences between the 2 stories. Besides the stuff that the anime added with filler, well, just look at some obvious things. The Universe X Tournament has a different ending. Goku doesn't use Blue Kaioken and instead utilizes Super Saiyan God and Blue in his fight with Hid. Super Saiyan God never shows up in the anime until the Tournament of Power, and Vegeta never even uses it in general until the Broly movie. While in the manga, it's relevant in every arc, and Vegeta first shows it in the Goku Black arc. Speaking of that arc, Super Saiyan Rage doesn't exist in the manga, while Super Saiyan Goku Black doesn't exist in the anime. Everything about Fuse Zamasu is different, and the entire Goku Black arc goes really differently in the manga in general. It's basically its own thing. A lot of the plot points are completely different. For example, Trunks having the powers of a Supreme Kai, or Goku Black and Zamasu having a conflict between each other. The manga Tournament of Power also has a lot of things happen differently. Gohan fights Kefla. Toppo never uses a God of Destruction form. A bunch of fighters are knocked out by Kale. Things like that. I'm not going to go over all the differences, but the point is, there are a lot of differences. The more interesting thing is where these stories are similar to each other. And that's kind of where we could pinpoint where Toriyama's outline comes from. Because there are some things in the anime that line up with the manga and vice versa. Like, let's use the Goku Black arc as an example. The setup for the arc, how Zamasu turns evil, Goku Black's identity remaining a mystery, the 2 Zamasus fusing, things like that. Or in the Tournament of Power, the tingly back thing for Super Saiyan is present in both versions. Piccolo's elimination was the same in both versions, which is really weird, because that's like one of the most hated things about the tournament. And like a lot of the elimination order too, as well as the focus on Goku unlocking Ultra Instinct. So while we don't know the full picture of what Toriyama's outline looks like, we know there is some sort of defined outline he made. Okay, well, doesn't that answer the question? Toriyama's outline, that's the canon thing, right? And yeah, I feel like that would be a simple answer, but again, we don't know the full details of that. Plus, Toriyama's involvement doesn't just end there. So obviously after the Tournament of Power, there's the Broly movie. But then after that, there's 2 manga exclusive arcs. Things that haven't been adapted by the anime or any of the movies. These aren't even acknowledged by the movies, which is really strange. The Galactic Patrol Prisoner Saga and the Granola the Survivor Saga. For the Galactic Patrol Prisoner Saga, aka the Moro arc, Toyotaro has said that he worked on it jointly with Toriyama. To what extent, not everybody knows, but Toriyama did oversee a lot of what Toyotaro did and still did provide a lot of corrections even in this arc. In terms of the story, it seems like this one was mostly Toyotaro though, but again, Toriyama still was involved, so was there more of a super outline here that we're just not seeing? And then as for the Granola arc, Toyotaro actually did say Toriyama made a draft for this arc. On top of that, we know some of the things he included too. For example, the Namekian's origin, which we actually learn more about later in Daima, so that lines up. And he also created the Heaters, as well as designing Manaido, who, fun fact, was originally named Slug, but they had to change that to avoid confusion with the other Slug. So while we don't know how much he was involved in the Moro arc, for the Granola arc, Toriyama seemed to be pretty involved with it. He literally created the main villains for that arc. And they jointly came up with Vegeta going down a different path from Goku, leading into Ultra Ego. And then after this arc, we have the superhero film. Apparently this movie was the most Toriyama's been involved with the series for a while. And if you look at the manga version of the story too, it actually lines up with the movie very closely. For the parts that were covered in the film, there are only a few small differences. But obviously there's some extra stuff here too. There's an entire prequel right before it, based on Goten and Trunks, and there's an epilogue that wasn't included in the movie, with Gohan going to Beerus' planet and all the fights that happen on there. Toriyama also had a hand in the extra stuff too. He even designed the Saiyaman X suits, and came up with some of the things in the high school saga. And up until the very last chapter he was involved, because the final panel was actually changed by Toriyama. Toyotaro actually was the one to confirm this. which is a pretty bittersweet note because, excluding the one-shot chapter that Toyotaro made recently, this was the final chapter for Dragon Ball Super that we got, and the final piece of Dragon Ball Super in general that we got. As far as we know, this might even be Toriyama's final contribution to Dragon Ball Super in general, with his inclusion of that panel of Piccolo waving goodbye. Sorry, I don't mean to get too depressing there, but that's very fitting for him as the last thing he did on the series, considering Piccolo was one of his favorite characters too. So now, back to the original question. Will this mean the manga is part of the quote-unquote canon? Well, it's still adapting Toriyama's story and has oversight from Toriyama, and even the additional arcs had extra things from Toriyama. And again, I have to emphasize, the extent to which he wrote certain parts is unknown, but nonetheless, this continuation is just as valid as the anime, if not more so. But neither of these were fully written by Toriyama. And of course, these stories do contradict each other. We essentially have two timelines for modern Dragon Ball, the anime and the manga. The movies actually line up with the manga since the manga basically tells you to watch the first two movies. Like, if you look at Battle of Gods, it's very minutely different, but it's basically an abridged movie. Resurrection F only got partially adapted and is completely unfinished. Broly was originally skipped and then recapped in the superhero arc. And then the superhero arc is just like the movie but extended. And then of course we have the third Toriyama outline timeline, and that's where the anime and manga diverge from. And on top of that, the Jaco manga as well as Dragon Ball Minus are part of this too. Those two were wholly made by Toriyama. Jaco is a character that does consistently appear in both versions of the story, and his story is basically just a prequel to Dragon Ball because the whole plot is him going to Earth to kill Goku. Or I guess Kakarot in that instance. And Minus is very blatantly canon now because besides the fact that it was written by Toriyama, it does show up in the Broly movie, and it gets expanded upon in the Granola arc. But what's the definitive timeline then? The main one we could follow is the Jaco manga, leading into the Dragon Ball manga, leading into the Tarbell special, then Battle of Gods and Resurrection F, then Toriyama's outline of Dragon Ball Super, which we don't have the full picture of, then Broly, then Moro and Granola, then Superhero, specifically the manga version of that story because it's more encompassing and still had his involvement. It's a really big jumble of stuff, and since we don't have the full outline, either the anime or manga version can be substituted for that. Of course, there are other things we could technically include, such as Dr. Slump having obvious connections in Dragon Ball, and Toriyama's one-shot Kentoki being referenced in Jaco, so that might even exist there too. And then there's other works he's done, such as Nekomajin, which serves as a parody for Dragon Ball, but focusing purely on Dragon Ball stuff and not going into anything else besides that, or trying to place them into the timeline or say they're canon or whatever. Let's just stick with everything I just outlined. And wow, that is a lot to cover. Thankfully, that's all. Surely there's nothing. Oh shit, there's Daima. Now that Daima's finally over, of course everyone's going to discussions of whether or not it's canon, whatever the hell that word means anymore. Let's start with connecting it to Super, or rather the things that don't connect it to Super, because there are more things that disconnect it from Super than connect it to Super. Even before the anime dropped, questions were being raised about it because Shin and Kibito were unfused, which is kind of a small thing in the grand scheme of things, but it was the first of a few contradictions that popped up, and not even the biggest one. For example, in Daima, the multiverse is mentioned, but everyone just forgets about it and learns about it later on in Super. Then there's Super Saiyan 3 Vegeta, which doesn't show up at all in Dragon Ball Super, and that can at least be explained away by saying the form is useless. I'm sorry, but functionally it is useless in Super. That's why Goku doesn't even use it anymore. But okay, these are a few things that we could just overlook. And then there's Super Saiyan 4. And this is like the final nail in the coffin there. It never gets acknowledged again, and Goku has said before that he only has the 3 Super Saiyan forms, 1, 2, and 3. And then there's even a scene in the Moro arc where he's getting powered down and then de-transforms through all his stages. And when he de-transforms from Super Saiyan God, he drops into 3. And like, okay, obviously, Daima was made way after Super. So of course Super Saiyan 4 wouldn't have been included there by default, but it is a pretty big contradiction in a lot of ways. Especially because this isn't a form Goku only gets temporarily. Like, when he turns back into an adult, we see him willingly transform into it. And he explains that he was training to go beyond Super Saiyan 3 in the first place, and Neva just gave him that extra push he needed. So by all accounts, he should have access to that form, but he never uses it. Okay, well, what about all the connections to Super then? Like, yeah, the mention of Universe 7 contradicts things, but the fact that there's a Universe 7 should imply that this connects to Super story, right? And also, all the Supreme Kai's designs are used. Well, the simplest explanation is that Daima wanted to include the multiverse explanation, but also not design a bunch of new characters. The various Kai being part of Daima doesn't automatically mean Daima is part of Super. And yes, I know these contradictions don't majorly impact Super story, even Super Saiyan 4, because let's be honest, any form below Super Saiyan God was abandoned after the Battle of Gods happened. So there's two explanations for how this goes. One, Daima's part of Super and has a lot of contradictions. Or the simpler answer, which also seems to be the more likely one, they're not even connected. They're just alternate continuations of the manga. Daima is never marketed as a prequel to Dragon Ball Super, just as a sequel to Dragon Ball Z and specifically the Buu Saga. Which sounds like I'm splitting hairs, but that is a very important distinction. Akio Ioku, the president of Capital Corporation Tokyo, which basically manages and produces a lot of Dragon Ball products, including Daima, actually mentioned this in an interview. He said Toriyama's intention was just to continue after the Buu Saga, and then just leaves it at that. This just means it's simply a continuation of the manga story and doesn't automatically connect to Super. And really, the biggest connections to Daima are the mention of Universe 7, the designs of the Kai being there, and then Bardock in the intro being designed like his Dragon Ball Super version. So a better way to put it is that it's connected to the lore of Super, but in terms of the story, it's not actually connected. And of course, Toriyama did have heavy involvement in this project. Does that mean Daima is canon over Super? Is Super canon over Daima? And then there's also the fact that Toriyama had involvement in some of the video game projects too. He had some involvement adding extra things to Dragon Ball Z Kakarot, which just fleshes out Z, and then he also worked a bit on Dragon Ball Online, which is a defunct MMORPG that also had a bunch of its own lore. Online goes far beyond the original story and also contradicts a lot of what we've seen post-manga. He also had some very light involvement in other games. Like for example, Dragon Ball Heroes, he contributed to some designs there and oversaw some things. Of course, none of these take precedence over the main story, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention he occasionally did dabble in the video games. These aren't the only examples either, but just some extra tidbits. And the Dragon Ball video games obviously opens up a whole other can of worms because they have their own different continuities, especially Dragon Ball Heroes. And like, Heroes is pretty fleshed out too, and completely contradicts a lot of the stuff in the main story. But like, if we're just focusing on purely Toriyama stuff that is supposed to be part of the main story, we've basically got the gist of it so far. And at the end of the day, what I'm mainly trying to say in this video is, there's no point getting lost in the weeds when it comes to discussing Dragon Ball's story, because the big picture is, Dragon Ball has a bunch of branching storylines now, and it's been like this for a while. And like, even though this isn't Toriyama stuff, look at that last video I made about Dragon Ball Z and how Toei tried to connect the movies to everything. When you try to connect stuff, it gets really confusing, because it seems like some things are clearly intended to be their own continuity, and not meant to be connected. And like, we don't even know what Toriyama's full vision for what a post-Buu saga Dragon Ball looks like. We don't have the full picture for the Dragon Ball Super outline. I mean, look at the Peaceful World saga in the original manga. That doesn't even align with anything Toriyama's written afterwards. Well, I guess Daima kind of fits with it, but Super definitely doesn't. Dragon Ball is a huge franchise with multiple different side stories, multiple different interpretations, multiple continuities, whatever you want to call them. Some of which even do interact with each other. And things are ever changing too. What you may call a retcon might simply be a more up-to-date adaptation of the same story, or an alternate version of the story in a new timeline, or an actual retcon in some cases. Everything is connected, but at the same time, everything is separate. The movies Toriyama worked on, the Dragon Ball Super manga, the Dragon Ball Super anime, Dragon Ball Daima, each of them is undoubtedly connected to the original story. And yeah, I get that it makes things confusing. People want to make sense of things and figure out the definitive timeline. But in my eyes, all of this is definitive. They're just alternate versions of what happens. Whichever one you prefer, how you want to view it, how you want to connect things, that's going to differ from person to person. And I don't think there's a point endlessly debating it or trying to force a connection between everything. But let me know what you think below. And as usual, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all in my next video.